My name is Carrie Monosmith, and I'm the supervisor of the Environmental Health Section in the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality's Office of Drinking Water and Municipal Assistance. Staff within my section and staff at Michigan's local health departments are responsible for overseeing compliance with drinking water rules at all of Michigan's non-community water supplies or Type 2 water supplies. The goal of my presentation is to provide information on the revised total coliform rule to Michigan non-community water supply owners and operators. By the end of July, another presentation will be available on the DEQ website that describes the specific requirements for public water supplies defined as seasonal systems by the revised total coliform rule. In this presentation, I will give you a brief introduction on public water supply regulations in the United States and in Michigan, and an introduction to the requirements in the revised total coliform rule. Public water supply regulations. The regulations for drinking water exist to ensure that people receive a safe, reliable, and adequate supply of water. They exist to prevent illnesses from disease-causing bacteria that could be in the water, from metals or chemicals that could be present, and to ensure there is an adequate supply of water for all needs, including firefighting. In the United States, many of us take drinking water issues for granted. Most of us simply turn on a faucet and never give a thought about whether or not the water is safe to drink. This is largely due to the regulations in place that help keep the water safe. In Michigan, we use what is called a multiple barrier approach to protecting drinking water. Multi-barrier provides several layers of protection so that if one fails, the others in place will reduce the chance of anyone getting contaminated drinking water. Examples of barriers include selecting a good water source and protecting it from potential contamination. If water is obtained from a well, the well must be properly constructed and maintained. Another example of a barrier is ensuring that pipes that carry the treated water throughout the system do not leak and are constructed from materials that meet drinking water standards. Finally, the most important barrier is conducting a monitoring program that routinely samples and tests the drinking water quality. Without it, there is no way to know if the water is truly safe to drink. Monitoring the quality of a supply's drinking water is a key part of the entire public water supply regulatory program at the federal level and in Michigan. So, what is a public water supply? The legal definition in Michigan is a facility or business that provides water for drinking or household purposes to persons other than the supplier or owner of the water supply, and the water is served to more than one living unit. Really, simply put, the only water supplies that are not defined as a public water supply in Michigan are residential drinking water wells that are only used by the family that lives there. In Michigan, we refer to those water supplies as private drinking water supplies. Also, it's important to understand that water must not only be safe for drinking, but needs to be safe also for food preparation, hand and dishwashing, toothbrushing, and bathing. Federal regulations define two major types of public water supplies: non-community and community. Community water supplies serve the same people at their residences year-round. They typically are municipal systems, such as the Lansing Board of Water and Light or the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. However, manufactured housing communities and apartments with their own drinking water supplies are also community water supplies because they serve people that generally reside there year-round. Non-community water supplies are classified as either non-transient or transient, and basically the transient or non-transient terms describe the type of population served based on the type of business or facility that they are. Transient means that the people served tend to come and go without staying for long periods of time. Restaurants, motels, and campgrounds are classified as transient non-community water supplies. Non-transient means that the people served there are there for a much longer period of time. These supplies include schools, daycares, office buildings, and manufacturing facilities. Michigan's regulations do include a definition for what is called a Type 3 public water supply. They are not regulated or defined by the federal government, so the Type 3 water supply, public water supply, is a unique feature in Michigan. Over 40 years ago, Congress passed the Safe Drinking Water Act. And in that act, it authorized the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, with the regulation of all public drinking water supplies in the country. EPA was also authorized to set national primary drinking water standards. These are the regulations that all public water supplies must comply with. There are generally two types of standards: maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, and treatment techniques. MCLs are set numbers or values that, if exceeded, result in a violation of a drinking water standard. A treatment technique standard is an action that must be done to ensure the water is safe, and failure to do that action would then be a violation of a treatment technique standard. Some of the regulated contaminants, there is no way to sufficiently analyze them in a water sample. And in those, that's particularly where EPA depends on treatment technique standards to ensure the proper treatment of the water to prevent those contaminants from reaching the public. In the Safe Drinking Water Act, Congress also allowed EPA to grant authority to the states to implement the Federal Drinking Water Act and the National Primary Drinking Water Standards. This is called primacy. All of the states in the country, including Michigan, have primacy except for the state of Wyoming. For a state to receive primacy for a federal drinking water standard, it must meet the criteria that are listed on this slide. Last year, Department of Environmental Quality staff began revising Michigan's Safe Drinking Water Act, Act 399, to adopt the federal revised total coliform rule. A primacy application for the revised total coliform rule will soon be submitted to EPA for review and approval. EPA may not formally grant primacy to Michigan for the revised total coliform rule for several years, but it will not affect the date the rule becomes law in Michigan, which is April 1st, 2016. The remainder of my presentation will be an introduction to the revised total coliform rule. The revised total coliform rule was published in the Federal Register on February 13th, 2013. The rule will replace the existing total coliform rule and will be in effect on April 1st, 2016. It will apply to all public water supplies, community and non-transient and transient non-community water supplies. In many aspects, the revised total coliform rule is similar to the total coliform rule that is in effect today, but in a few areas there are some significant changes. There will no longer be an MCL for a positive total coliform sample result. The MCL will be for a positive E. coli sample result. However, even though the MCL will become based on a positive E. coli result, a certain number of positive total coliform results will trigger a requirement to assess the water supply to assure there is not a sanitary defect present that could further threaten the safety of the drinking water. These assessments must be performed within 30 days and if problems are found, corrections must be made to avoid a treatment technique violation. Supplies must have an approved sample siting plan that designates where routine samples and repeat samples are collected, and it must be followed. If a non-community water supply triggers one of the criteria in the revised total coliform rule, the supply must increase monitoring frequency immediately. A supply can request a reduction in monitoring frequency, but the criteria that must be met to reduce monitoring are difficult to achieve. Any non-community water supply defined as a seasonal system per the rule will have additional requirements that must be met. Seasonal system requirements will be discussed in another presentation that we hope to have available on our DEQ website by the end of July 2015. E. coli MCL violations occur from any one of the following sampling scenarios. All total coliform positive samples must be tested for E. coli. As I mentioned earlier, assessments are required by the revised total coliform rule if certain rule criteria are triggered. The triggers are having a certain number of total coliform positive samples or failing to collect the required repeat samples after a total coliform positive routine sample. If the requirement to perform a level 1 assessment is triggered, the owner or operator of a non-community water supply must inspect all components of their water supply to make sure there is not a sanitary defect present that could increase the risk of the water containing a hazardous microorganism such as E. coli. If a sanitary defect is found, the rule requires that it be corrected promptly. The level 1 assessment is more basic than a level 2 assessment, and it can be performed by the owner or operator of the supply. This is the level 1 assessment form created by the Department of Environmental Quality for use by all non-community water supplies. The form can be obtained from the DEQ website. When a level 1 assessment must be performed, the owner or operator will complete all areas of this form and return it to their local health department. There are 8 areas of the supply to be inspected or evaluated, and each of those areas requires a yes or no response based on the findings. There is also room on the form to include comments on other situations that might have occurred during the sampling. Please do not be intimidated by the form. Complete it to the best of your ability and contact your local health department if you need help. It should be viewed as a tool to help you record assessment findings and discuss any problems found during the assessment with your local health department sanitarian. It is important to return the completed level 1 assessment form within 30 days of triggering the requirement for it to be done. Not returning the form within 30 days is a treatment technique violation. Any problem found during the assessment must be corrected within a reasonable amount of time as negotiated with your local health department sanitarian. The level 2 assessment is a more in-depth and comprehensive assessment than the level 1 assessment is. The requirement to perform a level 2 assessment is triggered by more serious events occurring, such as an E. coli MCL. The level 2 assessment will be conducted by the local health department at all of Michigan's non-community water supplies when they are triggered. The responsibilities for promptly correcting any sanitary defects found during the level 2 assessment are identical to the level 1 assessment requirements. Owners or operators will be expected to immediately fix simple, less costly corrections, such as replacing a cracked well cap with a new one. For complex or more expensive corrections, the owner or operator will be required to establish a corrective action plan or negotiated agreement that will contain firm dates that the work will be completed by. This slide lists some of the corrective actions that may be required depending on the assessment findings. Some of these may require more time to correct, such as replacing distribution system components. Those corrections may require the establishment of a corrective action plan with the local health department. The next several slides I have in this presentation are on the revised total coliform rule monitoring requirements. The revised total coliform rule allows non-community water supplies using a groundwater source that serve 1,000 or less people per day and are not defined by the rule as a seasonal system to transition into the rule at their current monitoring frequency when the rule becomes effective on April 1st, 2016. However, Michigan's local health departments do have the authority to determine the proper monitoring frequency of the non-community water supplies within their jurisdictions. Some non-community water supplies will be required by their health department to monitor more frequently when the rule becomes effective. If so, the local health department will directly notify the supply. This slide lists the revised total coliform rule monitoring requirements. You may notice that some of these are identical to those you are familiar with that are in effect now under the current total coliform rule. The number of samples that are collected in a monitoring period, be that monitoring period be annual, quarterly, or monthly, is based on the number of people that are served there per day. If 1,000 or less are served, one routine sample must be collected during the collection period. If 1,001 to 2,500 people are served per day, the rule requires 2 routine samples to be collected during that collection period. The number of samples collected increases then as the population served increases. Non-community water supplies on any monitoring frequency, be it annual, quarterly, or monthly, are required to collect 4 repeat samples for each total coliform positive routine sample. For those monitoring annually or quarterly, another 3 routine samples must be collected the following month. For those that are monitoring monthly, there are no additional samples required the following month after a positive because they will already be collecting a routine sample that month. Repeat samples are collected until they are all negative for total coliform or the requirement to perform an assessment has been triggered. For most of the non-community water supplies in Michigan, a positive total coliform routine sample and 1 total coliform positive sample within the set of 4 repeat samples will trigger the requirement to perform an assessment. There are several requirements in the revised total coliform that, if triggered, will increase the monitoring frequency of a non-community water supply. If a supply on annual monitoring fails to collect their annual routine sample, they will be required to increase their monitoring frequency to quarterly. If a system on annual monitoring triggers a level 2 assessment or triggers 2 level 1 assessments in 2 consecutive years, is cited with a coliform treatment technique violation, or has an E. coli MCL violation, they will be required to immediately increase monitoring frequency to monthly. A non-community water supply on quarterly monitoring will be required to immediately increase to monthly monitoring if a level 2 assessment is triggered, if the supply has had a second level 1 assessment within the last rolling 12-month period, if there has been an E. coli MCL violation or treatment technique violation, or if there have been 2 coliform monitoring violations or 1 coliform monitoring violation and 1 level 1 assessment within the last rolling 12-month period. For example, not submitting a Level 1 assessment form within the 30 days of triggering the requirement for it is a treatment technique violation. The supply will be required to increase monitoring frequency from quarterly to monthly the next month. These are the criteria that must be achieved for a supply to receive approval to reduce their monitoring frequency. To reduce monitoring from monthly to quarterly or to annual, the supply must have a clean compliance history for a minimum of 12 months prior to the request for monitoring reduction. Supplies that trigger a requirement to increase their monitoring then must remain at the increased frequency for a minimum of 12 months before a reduction in monitoring frequency can be approved. This is the conclusion of my presentation. There is much more information on the revised total coliform rule available on the DEQ website, including fact sheets, forms, and by the end of July, another presentation that will be specifically on the seasonal system requirements. Also, you can register for free email news updates from the DEQ by clicking on the red envelope symbol at the bottom of the DEQ webpage.